So what I've done here is actually make paths for each of the photos, and now I'm just selecting the paths from the photos, duplicating that layer, so now it's actually removed from its background. And then what I'll do is I'll actually drag that layer into my Photoshop file. And then here in this image, I've already made two paths as well. You can see them up here on the top right. Two paths for each building. And then basically make a marquee selection off of that path, duplicate, and then now I can duplicate the second building. So now they're freestanding on their own layer. In 1 second. On their own layers. And then now I can drag these layers into my main Photoshop file. Now I'm going to make a layer group for that. Drag it into that layer group, which is the yellow layer group for sci-fi buildings. And then there's the second building. And the third building. Now right off the bat you can actually see that the image file that I dragged these references from is much smaller than my original plate, but you can scale these up, and if there's any kind of artifacting with the image, then there is ways to gain back resolution into an image by painting back into it and using a couple filters. But ideally you really don't want to scale an image up too much to match your plate. You'd rather find a more high-res image that fits. But right now I'm just using these as placeholders to get a relative composition that I like, and also to see how they fit into my Chicago plate perspective. Now obviously you can see right off the bat, not to mention the scaling of this image, but the color temperature of each image is different. The foreground building is much more magenta. And then, right now I'm just scaling for a little bit of an idea for the perspective. And the top left buildings, you can see, are actually a little bit more yellow and green than our plate. And then basically what's going to happen now is, it's just a laborious task of trying to eyeball and make these three different buildings fit into your Chicago plate, which is, various ways to manipulate. What I'll typically do is I will duplicate the original reference layer and then just rename it as a copy. And again, this is just good practice, in the sense of habits. I always like to make sure that my layers have a naming convention. So right now I'm calling one building 1, and then building 1 copy, and then the next one would be building 2, and then building 2 copy, and so on for building 3 copy. And then typically what I'll do after that is make folders for these elements and put them relative to their distance from the camera. So like foreground, midground, background. And you can see here I'm just trying to place this building where I feel like it would work well. Looking at the original image imagery for scale issues, so you get a sense of like those trees and cars from the image of the building relative to our Chicago plate imagery. And then the reason why I duplicate and make copies is right now I'm scaling, so I'm actually doing a little bit of destructive to the relative image, because once you scale up an image and scale back down, you're not going to regain the pixels that you've altered. So that's why I save the original image that I dragged into the Photoshop file, and you can see right here I'm making an original folder, and all the images, folders go into that folder. And then that way, if I need to go backwards from what I've started here, then I have the original image. And then in above that folder is the working files of each building. And it's just a good habit, that way you don't have to start from scratch again. So you have the building as you brought it into Photoshop. And then right here you can see I'm just trying to scale up that back building to make it more immense but still fit in with the relative proportions based on its imagery.